So who gets the credit? One of the most interesting conversations I've ever had about faith and how we live our faith began and ended by trying to answer the question, who gets the credit? Now, that question emerged during a conversation between a young man and me while I was sharing ministry with a different congregation. And the conversation began when the young man asked me how much he and his family should give to the church. Now, like most clergy, I did not answer that question directly. Instead, I asked him how much he thought he should give to the church. And that question quickly turned into our attempt to answer who got the credit for his success in life. And this young man was quite successful in his career. He earned a very handsome salary, and that salary brought a lovely home, nice cars, and plenty of opportunities for him and his wife and their 2 daughters. He and his wife each owned a Harley Davidson, and if you know anything about those, you know they cost more than my car. And some of you will look at my car, which is a smart car, and say, well, that can't be worth much. And you're kind of right, but a Harley is worth more than most of our automobiles. Now, as we talked, it became clear that this young man believed that he deserved all the credit for everything that he had. He was quite proud of himself and his accomplishments, and he had gone to school, he had done well, and he had everything he wanted in life, and he believed that he deserved the credit for everything he was and everything he had. Now, Psalm 24 was written to remind the people of Israel who God really was and who we are in connection to God. King David was given credit for writing that psalm, and that really could be. And if the psalm was written by David, I suspect David wrote those words to remind himself of who got the credit in his life. David wrote, "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it." And if David is like most songwriters and preachers, he wrote the words that he himself needed to hear. Because David he was a very proud man. And it was easy for David to take pride in himself and his accomplishments. After all, he was the king who had replaced King Saul even before Saul knew it. He was the king responsible for capturing that city on a hill called Jerusalem. He was the king responsible for bringing the Ark of God, the Ark that was believed to have the presence of God in it, up to live in Jerusalem, the new capital. He was the king that God had chosen to lead the people of Israel. And David took great pride in being a good king, a good warrior, a good person. Like all things, pride has 2 sides. And David often thought of himself as all that and more. There were times when he looked in the mirror and he thought, I really am that good. Like the Disney story, he looked in the mirror and said, who's the best in the land? I am. And sometimes he really believed it. There were moments when David forgot that he had been blessed by God with the abilities and skills to be successful in those things he had been called to do. David forgot that he belonged to God and that everything he received, all of his abilities from God, were a gift from God. And when he forgot that all of these things were blessings from God, and he thought he was all that, well, that's when David got into really big trouble. Now, more often than not, David remembered who he was and who God was. He remembered that God had placed him in Israel at this time and in the place where his skills and abilities and opportunities could be of good use. And more often than not, David remembered that his job was to develop and use those God-given skills and abilities that he had. And more often than not, David remembered to be humble. He remembered that God had blessed him with everything he had and everything he was. And David wrote Psalm 24, I suspect in one of those moments when he was looking in the mirror and thinking, darn, you're good looking. You are such a good warrior. You're a great king. How could anybody resist you? You know that song, Oh Lord, It's Hard to Be Humble? Sometimes I'm sure David felt that way. And he wrote Psalm 24, I suspect, during one of those times to remind himself and everyone who read those lyrics that it is God who owns the earth and everything on it and everything in it. That it is God who blesses us with skills and abilities as well as opportunities to use those skills and abilities. And like I said, when David forgot to be humble, oh, he got into trouble. He'd forget who he was and who he was called to do, what he was called to do. And when he forgot he belonged to God and David chose to do whatever it was he wanted to do, life got hard for him and everybody around him. And let's face it, there are times when we do forget to be humble. There are times when we forget that we do work for God. We forget that God has given us our skills and abilities to do a job that God has called us to do. And when we forget who we work for and who's given us the skills and abilities and opportunities we have, well, most of us end up in some pretty difficult times. See, pride can be a false pride or a humble pride. And humble pride remembers that it is God who gave us skills and abilities as well as the opportunities to use them, all of those things that we have in life. Humble pride remembers that it is our job to care for God's people and to care for God's creation. Humble pride serves God by serving God's people. Humble pride doesn't just benefit us, it benefits everyone. Whereas false pride allows us to believe that we are solely responsible for all of our successes, that we got in that lucky genetic throw of the dice, and it really is about us. But false pride, well, that's usually a precursor to failure. So who gets the credit? Are we humble? Or do we get carried away with false pride? Do we believe that God has blessed us with skills and abilities and opportunities, or do we truly believe that we are self-made people? And I have to tell you, folks, I have never met anyone who is a completely self-made person. But we have all been blessed with skills. We've all been blessed with abilities. We have all been blessed with opportunities to use those skills and abilities. And it's up to us to develop those skills and abilities. It's up to us to make use of those opportunities and to remember that it is God who's blessed us with skills and abilities to develop and use. It is God who offers us the opportunities to be of use to God's creation and God's people. And our skills and abilities don't have to be anything grand. The ability to read and write is a blessing, because not everybody in today's world has that ability to read and write. The ability to stand and walk and carry heavy objects, that's a blessing, because not everybody in our world has the ability to stand and walk and carry heavy objects. The skills and the abilities we have, however grand or however meager they may be, however humble they may be, those are gifts from God. For instance, one of my skills is using words. I can string a bunch of words together. And I'm fortunate to be able to make a living using words. And God has blessed me with being born into a time and a place when a woman using words is considered by some to be valuable. Not that long ago, women were useful for having children, keeping the house clean, and helping in the fields. I would have been so out of luck. Asthma, allergies, definitely not being called to parent, although I love children. And bad hips and a bad knee would have consigned me as one of those women who was thought of as sickly. And I would have been put in a corner of the house, taken care of, but not considered worth very much. Instead, God blessed me with skills and abilities and the opportunities to use those skills and abilities. And my story is not unique. We all have similar stories. We all have a skill or an ability, and we all have an opportunity to use those skills and abilities. And whatever they are, whether they're considered grand by all or really an accomplishment for us, humble in the eyes of others, God gets the credit. And when we remember that fact, our lives are so much smoother. Our lives are so much happier. And when we allow ourselves to be filled with false pride, life gets really, really hard. So today, I invite each of us to think about the skills and the abilities and the opportunities with which God has blessed us. And to ask ourselves honestly, what skills and abilities do we possess? What can we do? And then to thank God for giving us those blessings. And then to look at our lives and to ask, what opportunities are we being given to use those skills and abilities? And then thank God for the opportunities. Because when we put those things to use in the name of God, well, God gets the credit and life goes pretty well. So who gets the credit? Well, we can take humble pride in our successes. And when we do, let's always remember to thank God for who we are, what we have, and our successes in life. There will be failures, and we'll be tempted to blame them on other people. Or we can simply say, thank you, God, for the opportunity to learn something that, well, maybe I don't have the skills and abilities for. Or maybe it was the wrong opportunity. But let's remember to thank God, because we are truly, sincerely, very blessed people. Amen.